Sorry, I'm just going to start the recording. All right. Hello and welcome to Data Blitz E on the last day of ARP. Today we're going to be hearing from an awesome set of speakers. I'm just going to go over some ground rules. Can you all see my screen? And hopefully you can. Okay. Basically what we're going to do is in this session, we're going to keep our cameras and audios off. Questions are very welcome and they should be sent in a direct message to Kelsey Harris, my co-host for the day. The Q&A will all occur after the presentations. And, you know, we have a lot of people to get through today. So if you, in the case that you don't have your question answered, you can come to the Gather Town later and hopefully meet up with the speakers and continue the conversation there. So without further ado, I will call on the first speaker, and the title of the talk is Child Personality Facets and Dimensions of Mental Disorder, an investigation of broad spectra and specific syndromes by Cassandra M. Brandis.
All right, hello. Thank you for coming to this talk. Today I'm going to be talking about child personality facets and psychopathology. So people with particular forms of psychopathology tend to have certain traits in common. For internalizing problems like anxiety and depression, this tends to be high neuroticism. And for externalizing problems like antisocial behavior or ADHD, that tends to be high neuroticism and low agreeableness and conscientiousness. These traits are useful both in predicting who is likely to have emotional and behavioral problems in the future and in understanding the etiology of psychopathology. However, these broad five-factor model traits don't tell the entire story. So first, broad traits tend to be indiscriminately associated with all disorders within these internalizing and externalizing spectra. So that means that the traits become relatively non-informative for predicting whether, for example, a kid is more likely to develop anxiety versus depression. Second, some research in adult samples, including from people in this room, indicates that not all facets within each trait domain are equally related to each disorder. So we're missing potentially relevant information about why traits and disorders are related by just using the big five. So as such, facets are prime candidates for increasing our predictive accuracy for specific disorders and understanding why traits and psychopathology are connected. So we looked at facet level trait relationships with 7 common mental disorders and higher order psychopathology spectra in 2 samples of pre-adolescent children from North America. We looked at criteria counts from the CDISC and the 15 lower order facets of the ISID, which is a 5-factor model adjacent personality inventory that's reported by parents. And I'll just present some of the multiple regression results for the specific disorders today, but we did also include some empirically derived higher order psychopathology dimensions for comparison here. And here we regressed each criteria count on all of the facets within each big 5 domain. So this told us whether individual facets within each trait domain incrementally predicted each disorder and each spectrum beyond other facets within the trait within the same trait domain. All right, looking at some selected results, we found that while 5-factor model traits were sufficient to distinguish between internalizing and externalizing spectra, the distinctions between specific disorders were more observable when we looked at the facet level traits. So looking here at the example of ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder, so basically this is clinically significant like oppositionality, resistance, and disobedience to authority in kids. And what we're looking at here on the graph is the standardized betas and the 95% CIs for the regression models that I just mentioned. And here we can see that even though these 2 disorders both belong to the same externalizing spectrum and their facet level trait profiles are relatively similar for some traits, like we can see here for neuroticism at the top, each disorder does have a unique or a different set of facets that uniquely contribute to it. So as you can see within extroversion, while ODD is specifically associated with low positive emotionality here, ADHD is specifically associated with a different facet from extroversion, which is called considerateness. It's like thoughtfulness. And we can see kind of there's a similar thing going on with conscientiousness as well, where organized and being attentive or low on distractibility tend to uniquely predict ADHD, but this is not the case for ODD. Similarly, it's a similar sort of story if you look at the facets of agreeableness and the facets of openness. So in sum, facets increment the prediction of specific disorders above big five traits in North American children, and they may give us clues as to why we see these robust relationships between traits and psychopathology. So if you have any questions or want to learn more, you can reach me at this email. You can also reach out to me on Twitter. Thanks.
Thank you, Cassie. Next up, we have Antagonism in Daily Life by Colin Byes.
Hi, everyone. I'm Colin. I'm a postdoc researcher at the University of Pittsburgh, working with Aidan Wright. And I'll be presenting on a paper that recently accepted at Clinical Psych Science, where we looked at the relations between antagonism and a variety of EMA-based outcomes. So antagonism has a pretty long history in personality research, both in terms of general personality research, but also clinical work and clinical research. And it's consistently included in a variety of clinical nosologies, diagnostic categories, so things like antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and so on, and also basic models of personality. So to give a few examples, it's one of the major domains in the alternative model of personality disorders in DSM-5. It comprises half of the externalizing superspectrum in the high top model alongside disinhibited externalizing, and is pretty well captured by low agreeableness in the 5-factor model. And for this project, we kind of had two primary goals. The first was to combine advances in structural work on antagonism with EMA-based outcomes. So there's been a good deal of work kind of in the last like five years or so that's been pretty consistent in highlighting kind of what traits most researchers think are pretty important if we want to capture a pretty good chunk of this antagonistic domain. But it hasn't really been looked at too much in daily life. So we wanted to kind of take this first step towards merging structural and functional accounts of antagonism. And our second primary goal was to look at these relations across multiple samples and multiple operationalizations of antagonism. So kind of look at what types of effects are most robust, both in terms of how it's measured and what kind of sample is used. So in terms of research design, we use two popular measures of antagonism, the PID-5 brief form and the CAT-PD short form. Both of these allow for a look at kind of broad domain scores, but also specific facet scores. So kind of building nicely off of what Kathy just shared. There's a lot of information that you can get if you look at the facet scales and some information that you might lose if you only look at the domain. In terms of the EMA-based outcomes, we had a variety that we thought had kind of conceptual ties to antagonism, so things like interpersonal coldness, empathy, negative and positive affect, among some others. And in terms of how we examined those outcomes, these were just aggregated outcomes. So we looked at kind of average levels of negative affect, for example, reported over the course of the EMA protocol. So pretty straightforward in terms of the analysis plan. And to just give a look at our 4 different samples, relatively large samples for EMA-based studies, and we're comprised of both student samples, so students from the University of Pittsburgh, and also community members that were oversampled for either kind of past psychiatric or clinical care, and oversampled for interpersonal problems. So with 10 EMA outcomes and I think a total of 15 facet scales and then the 2 domain scales, tons of tables and figures and things like that. So really hard to condense that down. So what I present here is just kind of 2 of what I think are the main takeaways. So if folks were to have read the paper, 2 of the things that I hope people leave kind of the paper with after having read it. And number 1 is that there's important heterogeneity among the facet scales and the relations with EMA outcomes. Again, kind of reiterating the point from before, and definitely what Cassie had just said as well, is that if you're only looking at the domain, you might lose important information that exists at the facet level, both in terms of some facets might show no relations while others show significant relations, or kind of differences in the strength of relations amongst the facets. And in terms of the instrument also makes a difference. So even subscales that have shared names can kind of get at slightly different content, and that can affect the relationships with outcome. So for these two, manipulativeness scales show different relations with positive affect based on slightly different kind of content in those scales. With that, I'll end there. That's my contact information for anyone that has any questions or want to follow up. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Colin. Next up, we have I Want to Be With Her Forever versus I Threaten Divorce. Narrative identity themes in COVID-19 challenge narratives predict relationship well-being in recently married Latinx individuals.
Hi, everyone. My name is Holland Reicher. I conducted this research at Northwestern University with my clinical research colleagues at our affiliated therapy clinic, the Family Institute. As a narrative identity researcher, I'm interested in the layer of personality related to how we make meaning of our life experiences to help make sense of who we are through our life stories. And the narrative identity literature demonstrates a number of strong relationships between various narrative identity themes and individual outcomes such as Big Five personality traits or mental health. But there's very limited narrative identity research related to romantic relationships. So my colleagues and I were interested in what narratives could help us understand about couple health and functioning during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we surveyed participants who were under shelter-in-place orders at the outset of the pandemic, and we asked them to describe the biggest challenge they had faced as an individual part of their couple during the COVID-19 crisis, and to rate their relationship well-being on a number of different facets. So these 137 community members were part of an ongoing longitudinal study of marital health in Latinx couples. The majority of participants identified as Hispanic or Latinx, and about a third were essential workers, and about a third indicated that they had been furloughed or lost their jobs as a result of the pandemic. And over half of them were living with dependent children or other family dependents. We coded these narratives for a number of established narrative identity themes, so those that are frequently in the literature, such as affective tone, agency, and communion. And we also developed a number of novel themes, which reflected the sort of adjacent non-narrative identity, but narrative-esque relationship literature, and also the cultural literature related to our sample in particular. And we conducted correlation analyses to look at the relationship between these themes and a composite measure of relationship well-being. And we found that almost every narrative theme we coded for did in fact predict relationship well-being in our sample. So this is true for both the well-established themes from the literature and also novel themes that we developed for this study in particular, such as the extent to which the challenge was described as resolved, whether the individual saw the relationship become more cohesive or more conflictual, and so on. And just to give you a flavor of what this looked like, I want to show you excerpts quickly of one couple. You'll see the husband scores high on communion, affective tone, and challenge resolution, whereas the wife scores low on these same themes. So he said, "We are around each other too much as any other human. We get annoyed and we fight, but it's easier to face this challenge because I love her very much and I want to be with her forever." Whereas she said, "My spouse is always at home, relies on me for his entertainment, self-worth, and self-esteem. I threaten divorce, but I'm trying to see COVID-19 as a positive test in this relationship. Yet because of this challenge, I'm unsure if he truly knows me as a person and I question our marriage." So on average, themes like these did in fact predict how how satisfied individuals were with their relationships. So we believe that this evidence suggests that narrative identity methods could be very useful in understanding more about romantic relationships. And we can use both existing narrative themes that we understand well to investigate these questions, and that there's also opportunity to introduce novel themes such as those created in the study, which we hope will be tested in future research, both related to the romantic themes and also culturally specific narrative themes. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Holland. Next up, we have Are Moral People Happier? Presented by Jesse Sun.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming to this talk. Today I'll be presenting a project on whether moral people are happier in collaboration with Win Wu and Jeff Goodwin. I'm going to start with the premise that a good life involves having a concern for your own personal well-being, but also balancing that with a desire to improve other people's well-being for the greater good. But an important question is whether these two aspects of a good life are intertwined. The answer is not that obvious. On the one hand, by definition, morality involves sacrificing your own self-interests for the greater good. And so you might think that there could be a trade-off between moral character and personal well-being. Another perspective is that people have an intrinsic need to feel moral. And so in this light, perhaps morality and well-being go hand in hand. To answer this question, I decided to use reputation-based measures of moral character in two studies. In study one, we have two samples of college students from Penn and UC Davis. And in study two, we have 712 employees from a Chinese company, the R&D division of a Chinese company. We had these participants self-report their own subjective well-being as well as their meaning in life, because it could be possible that moral people aren't necessarily happier, but they have greater meaning in life. And to measure morality, instead of getting self-reports, which are clearly limited in this context, we used informant reports of morality. So in sample one, we have these college students' close others, which were mostly friends, but also some family members and romantic partners, report on these targets' moral character, using a 32-item index of various personality items that were rated as being highly morally relevant by another sample of participants. And this captured dimensions including compassion, respectfulness, dependability, honesty, fairness, loyalty, and general morality. In study two, the informants were actually the participants themselves, because the way the data was structured was that these employees were nested in teams of between 4 and 7 employees each. And so we had a round robin design in which every participant rated each of their other teammates on their moral character. So we have everyone rate each of their other team members on 10 moral character adjectives, such as how kind, generous, fair, and honest their team members were. For the analyses, we predicted either subjective well-being or meaning in life from informant reports of morality based on the aggregate of all available informant reports. And for study two, to account for the nested structure of employees nested within teams, we used multi-level modeling. Overall, we find mixed evidence for whether moral people have greater well-being. In study one, we find that across both samples, people who are seen as being more moral by their close others self-reported greater meaning in life. And these are all standardized betas. But we only saw that moral character was associated with subjective well-being, aka happiness, in one sample, and that was the Davis sample. In study two, our pre-registered analysis found a pretty clear null effect where we did not see an association between moral character and well-being. But an important caveat here was that we saw basically no agreement amongst teammates as to who was more or less moral within a team. So it's possible that that lack of agreement might explain this null effect. An important constraint of generality is that both of these studies capture relatively well-functioning people in probably a relatively normal range of moral character. So we don't necessarily know what happens at the highly moral or immoral extremes. So in a third study, I'm currently trying to sample people at the moral extremes to answer this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. Next up, we have implications of identity resolution in emerging adulthood for intimacy, generativity, and integrity across the adult lifespan, presented by Lauren L. Mitchell.
Sorry, I'm muted. Thanks so much. I'm really excited to talk about this project today. We've all probably seen diagrams like this of Erikson's model in intro psych textbooks. The traditional interpretation of Erikson's theory suggests that each stage of life has its own key developmental task or goal that should be accomplished at that time, and that each stage builds on the last. So moving forward into a new stage requires you to have successfully achieved the task from the last stage. Adolescence and emerging adulthood is seen as the right time for identity development. And in turn, that identity lays the foundation for intimacy, generativity, and integrity, the stages associated with young adulthood, midlife, and later life. So given that framework, what do we expect to happen to emerging adults who don't manage to figure out their identities at the right time? Many of us are college educators here. I know some of my students do have a clear sense of who they are and what they want out of life. But when I was in college, my friends and I were more like this. Erikson's theory would predict that we were in trouble, that people like this are going to really struggle when it comes to the next upcoming stages as they get older. Is that really true? Despite being a fairly central tenet of Erikson's model, most of the work out there on this question is decades old and relies on cross-sectional data. We wanted to rigorously answer the question, does identity resolution in emerging adulthood predict subsequent growth of intimacy, generativity, and integrity across the lifespan? It turns out we have the data to answer this question, just nobody's done it yet. So for this study, we used data from the Rochester Adult Longitudinal Study and a latent growth curve modeling approach to test whether identity resolution measured in the 20s predicted trajectories of intimacy, generativity, and integrity through the 60s. We expected that emerging adults with high identity resolution would experience growth in each of those later stages at the right time across their lifespan. And we expected those with low identity resolution would essentially be shut out of development in those later stages of intimacy, generativity, and integrity because they missed out on identity earlier in life. Our findings were not what we expected at all. Instead, what we found was that emerging adults with higher identity resolution also tended to be high on intimacy, generativity, and integrity in emerging adulthood already, and they maintained those stable, high trajectories across adulthood. They were already fairly mature on all of those stages very early in life compared to when Erikson thought they would develop. And emerging adults with low identity resolution started out low on all of those outcomes, but caught up to their peers over time. By the time everyone was in their 60s, those differences had really shrunk a lot. So why does this matter? Well, in terms of Erikson's theory, this evidence really calls into question the idea that psychosocial development proceeds in a linear, stage-like manner, the way that we tend to teach people. It also suggests that these constructs may not be as distinct from each other as Erikson believed. The fact that we saw identity, intimacy, generativity, and integrity all co-occurring together in emerging adulthood suggests that there might be a general psychosocial maturity factor driving the development of all of them. Finally, I think our results are fairly optimistic about the question, is it a problem if emerging adults don't have their identity figured out yet? Even those with low identity resolution were able to develop intimacy, generativity, and integrity, just more slowly and gradually. This paper is in press and much more details available in the preprint here. I'm also very happy to chat if you want to shoot me an email. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lauren. Next up, we have evaluating the structure of subjective well-being, a large-scale experience sample presented by Michael A. Busseri.
Hi, everyone. This research is concerned with the structure of subjective well-being, or SWB, that is, how life satisfaction, positive affect, and negative affect together form or reflect the construct of subjective well-being. There is little consensus concerning its structure. Some researchers treat SWB as an umbrella term and examine the three components separately. Others study SWB as a latent factor indicated by LS, PA, and NA. Others still prefer a causal system in which PA and NA serve as inputs to life satisfaction. So clarifying its structure has implications for several fundamental questions about SWB, including what is it? How do we theorize about its causes, consequences, correlates? How do we synthesize results? How do we identify effective interventions? Only a few studies have examined such issues directly, and little is known about the structure of SWB based on multiple moments from individuals' lives. Further, researchers have yet to test competing structural approaches within the same analytic model. With these issues in mind, the goal of the present study was to examine the structure of SWB in individuals' daily lives using an integrative analytic model. Drawing on data from a large-scale experience sampling study, we examined a subsample of participants who rated their current life satisfaction, positive and negative affect, at 4 or more occasions. We tested a random intercepts cross-leg panel model based on an approach introduced by Haymaker et al. Variance in each repeatedly assessed SWB component was decomposed into stable trait-like variance, separate from state-like variance. The trait-like variation was used to estimate latent random intercept factors for LSPA and NA separately based on their correlations across measurement occasions, as well as a higher order latent SWB factor indicated by the 3 latent random intercepts. The state-like variance was used to estimate latent SWB factors at each measurement occasion and occasion-specific loadings from LSPA and NA. We also estimated autoregressive and cross-legged effects among the 3 components between adjacent measurement occasions. An overview of the analytic model is provided here, which will be available as part of the video recording. So model testing provided strong support for this particular model. Each of the latent random intercept factors had strong loadings from the repeatedly assessed SWB components. Also, the higher order latent SWB factor had strong loadings from each random intercept. Within occasions, the latent SWB factors had strong loadings from LSPA and NA at each occasion. In contrast, cross-legged predictive effects were small in magnitude and inconsistent across components and occasions. Together, these findings provide strong support for conceptualizing SWB in individuals' daily lives as a hierarchical construct. From this perspective, SWB is best understood as a latent underlying tendency reflected in evaluations of life satisfaction, along with positive and negative affective experiences. Accordingly, in order to study SWB, all 3 components need to be assessed together and a latent SWB factor needs to be estimated. Further, summaries and syntheses about SWB need to include tabulation of results based on a latent SWB factor, representing the commonality among LSPA and NA, rather than or in addition to results concerning the 3 components separately. Finally, from an applied perspective, when developing methods for boosting SWB, researchers should test the impact of a given intervention on a latent SWB factor, not just on LSPA and NA separately. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. Up next, we have trajectories of depression and anxiety symptoms over time in the transition to university, their co-occurrence, and the role of self-critical perfectionism, presented by Shelby Levine.
Hi, hi, I'm Shelby, and I'm really excited to present this research today on behalf of my colleagues at Carleton University. This is currently in process development in psychopathology. Additionally, all our data, code, and output is available on OSF, and we have a preprint uploaded. Mental health is a huge problem on university campuses. Over 80% of students report feeling overwhelmed at some point over the year. Over 70% of students report some sort of anxiety or depressive symptoms over the year. But the literature is silent on kind of why this is occurring and how this is occurring. And a lot of research doesn't even look at anxiety and depression development together. And the research that has looked at this together has looked at growth curve models, which generalize over many different people. So for example, if I had high stable depression and someone else had low increasing depression, if you generalized across both of us, you're really missing out the nuance on each of our experiences. So that was really our first question, was how do anxiety and depression symptoms co-develop over time in the transition to university? And using latent class growth curve analyses, we were able to look at these different clusters of change to see the heterogeneity in student development of these mental health problems. And second, why are students developing these mental health problems? So we looked at self-critical perfectionism as a risk factor. Self-critical perfectionism has been on the rise over the past 3 decades in university students, and it's also been found to be a transdiagnostic risk factor for mental health problems, for eating disorders, anxiety, and depression. Additionally, students have to have really high standards to get into university, and often these symptoms are associated with cognitive distortions like fear of failure, self-doubt, self-criticism, which have all been found to contribute to mental health problems, and is maybe something that we can intervene upon. So, sorry. So we collected over 650 students, and we started surveying them in August before they started university, and three more time points throughout their first year in university, measuring anxiety, depression, perfectionism, and some other personality and control variables. All our surveys are on OSF if you're curious. And then we did this latent class growth curve analyses with conditional models with self-critical perfectionism to see how many different classes of symptom development were there, as well as were students higher in self-critical perfectionism more likely to be in more severe symptom trajectory classes. We also controlled for the other facet of multidimensional perfectionism, personal standards perfectionism, gender to see if there were differences between men and women, and neuroticism. Neuroticism is highly correlated with self-critical perfectionism, and there's often a question of how different these traits are. So here are my results. So we found 40% of students experienced elevated or increasing mental health problems during the transition to university. But maybe a bit of a silver lining, that means 60% of students were in class 3, meaning that they had stable, low anxiety symptoms and low increasing depression symptoms. Meaning maybe most students are transitioning okay to university, but still 40% is a huge proportion. And moreover, we found 6 different trajectories, meaning that there's a lot of heterogeneity in how students are developing mental health problems in their transition to university. And it's not really a one-to-one thing. So if you look at class 1 and 2, both of those groups have moderate stable anxiety, but one group has a low increasing depression.
We're going to see you on Monday, true?
Oh, and the other group has a moderate stable depression. Meaning that we really need to look at these different trajectories of change to understand how symptoms are developing so that we can early identify these problems and intervene. Next, our second research question, we found students high versus low in self-critical perfectionism were more likely to experience greater anxiety and depression symptoms, meaning they were more likely to be in these elevated or increasing transition trajectory groups, meaning that this might be a great place to intervene. Thank you for listening, and I don't know, you can find me on Twitter.
Thank you very much, Shelby. Last but not least, we have Assessing the Desire to Change Personality Across Methods, presented by Travis J. Miller.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Sorry, I'm on the wrong screen. So for the most part, investigations of the desire to change personality have used 3 methods. Trait change inventories have been adapted existing trait measures by changing items from I am to I want to be, and then changing the rating scales from strongly disagree to strongly agree to much less than I currently am to much more than I currently am. Another approach is ask participants to provide open-ended goals without specifying content. These goals are then coded by judges for if they represent the desire to change each trait in each direction. A third method asks participants directly to provide a goal to change personality. Again, these goals are coded for increases and decreases in each trait. Findings across methods have consistently shown that most people desire to change some aspect of their personality. Most people want to change in the socially desirable direction, and that the desires to change are inversely related to current trait standing. The purpose of the current study was to compare these methods to each other within person. So to do so, I collected data from 500 Tulane undergraduates. I first asked them to provide open-ended goals up to 15, then asked for a directly targeted personality change goal, and then asked them to complete the CBFI2 in this order, and they also completed the BFI2. The results from each method replicated the previous findings very closely. The biggest discrepancy was really that there are fewer goals to increase extroversion and more goals to increase emotional stability. I think this may be due to the fact that the data were collected last fall, where the students were under pretty strict testing and monitoring for COVID. So results from each method were then compared to each other using conditional means. While generally results were in the correct direction, there was not as much consistency across the methods as we would have hoped. In fact, extroversion was the only trait that appeared consistent across all three methods. This might suggest that the methods describe different aspects of the desire to change personality, and the methodological differences kind of suggest the same. So compared to other methods, indicating the desire to change trait with an inventory is a relatively easier task, requiring participants to just score a non-zero value. So this leads to higher endorsement rates of each trait, which essentially might mean that participants are indicating a desire to change in a trait that they don't actually intend to put effort towards changing. And it may be that these ratings represent the personality traits that they value and not necessarily the personality traits they wish to have for themselves or wish to change. While it seems that the other two methods may be more tied to intentions to change, the methods are by no means without flaw. For one, the interpretation of the results is much more convoluted than with inventories. For example, with open-ended goals, it's unclear if having multiple goals to increase extroversion means that it is more important to the participant that they increase their extroversion, or if the magnitude of desired change is larger. And with the directly targeted personality change goals, the participant's personal definition of personality has undue influence on the results. For example, here, 27% of the goals provided by participants when asked for a goal to change their personality did not conform to what the judges thought was part of personality traits. So further research on the differences among these methods is needed. Perhaps new methods should be developed. I kind of like the idea of taking these making the trait change inventories ipsative to get the results to, it might result in the data kind of better describing individuals' desire to change, or kind of implementing importance ratings on open-ended goals. Future work should also look at the differential predictive validity of each method. If you're interested in the details of the study, feel free to reach out to me or check out the paper in a forthcoming issue of Journal of Personality Assessment. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Travis. So that concludes the Blitz portion of the talks today. And now we're going to switch over to questions. And Kelsey had to leave, so there's a slight change. What I'll do is she sent me the questions that she received, and then we have some time to just kind of open up the floor. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand or you can just unmute yourself. But I will start with the first question, and this one is for Holland. And the question is, how do the narrative themes work differently in the actor-partner interdependence model? What were the partner effects of the narrative themes?
And now I teased this very complicated thing for a data blitz in the chat, but basically we were able to look using that model at how husbands' own theme scores influence their relationship well-being and how their wives' theme scores influence them and vice versa. And what we found was there was quite different themes that were influencing. So both, for example, individuals were influenced, or both halves were influenced by their own communion scores, but only the husband's agency influenced his relationship well-being and also the wife's relationship well-being. So there were a number of effects like that where we were able to parse out the individual influences of each theme on each partner. I hope that's a tiny little snippet of a response. I know we don't have much time.
Thank you, Holland. So with that, I'll open up the floor. Does anybody have questions for our speakers today? Feel free to, again, unmute yourself, raise your hand, use the chat. So we got a quiet group today. That's okay. If there are no questions, right? Oh, here we go. Bora says, this question is for Jesse's son. I am curious about her predictions at moral extremes and the study she is planning. Can she talk more about it?
Thanks for that question, Bora. One idea I had is that perhaps there's a U-shaped relation between well-being and morality, such that people are only less happy if they're extremely immoral, and perhaps if they're extremely moral and too self-sacrificing, then they would also be less happy. But in the middle, there might be less of an effect. So that was one idea I had. And the study I'm currently running to address this involves a nomination design where I have a group of nominators nominate 3 people who they personally know and consider to be among the most moral, least moral, and morally average people they know. We're then emailing these targets to recruit them for the study, obviously not telling them why they were recruited, but just saying that an acquaintance participated and like helped us recruit more participants. And then to further validate the nomination method, these targets are also nominating their own informants. So we have an additional continuous measure of moral character from the informants, as well as a group-based measure. So data collection has been a bit slower because of various issues with trying to get people to respond to unsolicited surveys, but it's happening and we're continually updating the design to try to get more targets to respond. Thanks for your interest.
All right, thank you, Jesse. Here's a question for Travis Miller. What were the 27% of open responses like that weren't deemed by researchers to be relevant to changing personality? What kind of content was represented?
Yeah, so there's quite a bit. Some that was like pretty obviously not personality things, like get in better shape and things like that we just, it wouldn't be considered part of personality. But there were things that were close but weren't necessarily didn't necessarily fit well in the Big Five framework. Things like confidence, and there are a few others off the top of my head I'm not remembering. But yeah, there were, it spanned the whole range of things you might imagine. But and that is a fairly common number, about 25-27%. When you ask people, do you have a goal to change your personality, what isn't coded as part of personality.
Thank you, Travis. So with that, I think we'll conclude today's Data Blitz session E. In about a minute, they're doing a roundtable discussion of all the invited symposia chairs. So we hope to see you there. And if not, for the speakers here today, if you want to continue the conversation with our lovely audience members, we encourage everybody to go to GatherTown at 5:30 today. Thanks a lot. See you soon.
Thanks for organizing this, Joanne.